From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, we're going to start. I'm Jennifer Harpster. I'm a research specialist at the Library Science, Technology and Business Division. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Chicago Victory Gardens, Yesterday and Tomorrow. Without a doubt, community gardens are making news. Just recently, Prince Charles was in D.C., and guess where he wanted to visit? That's right, a community garden, which is actually an urban farm located in LaDuat Park called the Common Good City Farm. And First Lady Michelle Obama also emphasizes community and school gardens in her Let's Move campaign. The Library of Congress is no stranger to the subject of gardening. Thomas Jefferson, who helped reestablish the library with his personal collection after the burning of the Capitol in 1814, was an avid gardener. Some of his gardening books, such as Every Man His Own Gardener and Miller's Garden Dictionary, became part of the Library of Congress collection. The library continues to collect a great deal of material on gardening and horticulture, which in turn provides the researcher with historical, specialized, and current content. Our lecture today will delve into the history of victory gardens and their close relationship with today's community garden movement. The concept of victory gardens was established in 1917, 3 years into World War I, when the National War Garden Commission initiated the Liberty or War Garden Program. When the United States entered World War II, Americans once again aided the war effort and planted victory gardens. Today, Americans are embracing this tradition and growing food in community and school gardens, as well as on urban farms. Our speaker today is LaManda Joy, an award-winning gardener, blogger, writer, speaker. Maybe I shouldn't have had all that coffee before I spoke. An edible garden advocate. She's a member of the American Community Gardening Association and a member of the Garden Writers Association and the Culinary Historians of Chicago. I first met her in the summer of 2010. After we corresponded through our Ask a Librarian service. Her quest was to find primary sources about Chicago's victory gardens and the Office of Civilian Defense. I learned that she started a community garden, the Peterson Garden Project, in Chicago, which happens to be on land that was originally part of a World War II victory garden. She was partly conducting this research for an upcoming crosstown production, Victory, a Homegrown Documentary, which this documentary will highlight past and present community gardening in Chicago, and at the same time inspire gardeners to start their own community garden. The Peterson Garden Project won first place in Mayor Daley's 2010 Landscape Awards for Best Community Garden, and was a finalist in the 2010 Greenworks Community Leadership Award. We are really happy to have LaManda here today to share with us the history of Chicago's victory gardens and its current community garden endeavors. So please join me in welcoming LaManda Joy.
Thanks, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today. I also wanted to extend a special thanks to Connie and Jennifer for their assistance with my research on this topic and also for setting up this lecture today, and it's really great to see all of you here. My husband's here with me today, and he got me a Starbucks, and he said, now remember how caffeinated you get, so if I'm talking too fast, I am very enthusiastic about this topic. If I'm talking too fast, just make the gesture, slow down, slow down. I'm sure he'll make the gesture if that happens. So today we're going to talk about the subject of victory gardens. My area of focus is Chicago, but the stories and the themes are applicable to most of the major urban areas in the country. So we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I'm assuming that everybody here knows what a victory garden is. If you don't, does everybody understand the concept of victory gardens? Okay, good. Well, what you may not know is that the first mention of this in literature happened in the 1600s in England. So it's something that's happened for many, many years. It's makes sense. Someone's going to be coming in and pillaging. We better take care of ourselves. The supply lines might be cut. We may not have help from the neighbor town, etc., which is a pretty common idea. What you might also know is what I like to call the sound bites about victory gardens. If you've read any newspaper article or magazine article or blog post in the last 5 years, you've probably heard a couple statistics. One, that 20 million people, or 20 million gardens during World War II, 40% of the food, fresh produce was produced, etc. Those are what I like to call the sound bites of this story. And they inspired me to get interested in the deeper story of how that all happened. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Why am I talking about them? We're getting to that. First of all, I have greatest generation parents. This is my parents. They met in when they were 13 years old at Samuel Gompers Junior High School in Los Angeles. They say it was love at first sight. Another interesting thing that happened that year was that we went to war. It was 1941. That's my dad, Ken. He got drafted in 1945, and he was a paratrooper in the occupied forces. He wanted to be in the demolition squad, but since the war was ending, they were getting rid of the demolition squad, so he thought he'd be in the airborne, and he did that because he got an extra $50 a month because it was dangerous. So my mother, Lorraine, was also a Rosie the Riveter, and they had been dating, as I said, since they were 13 years old, and they had talked about getting married, but they never really, he never really did anything about it. And so his getting drafted, his turning, 18 when he was going to be eligible for draft, him getting drafted was looming. And so my mother took matters into her own hands. She planned their wedding. She sent him an invitation to his own wedding. He bought a suit, and the rest is history. He also told me once that he thought tall women were really sexy, which, as you can tell, is a good thing. So this next June, they've been married 67 years. They're really incredible people. So as I said, my dad was involved in the war. My dad had a large family, 5 other siblings. That's my dad on your right, my mom in the middle. On your left is my uncle, Arnold. He was involved in Pacific Theater. He was stationed on an island. They were sort of waiting to be transported. He came down with dengue fever, which is a malarial type virus, and wasn't able to ship out with the rest of his troops, which is probably a good thing because their ship got bombed and everybody perished. So he was lucky in that regard. Well, I also had another uncle who I don't have a photo of that was a bomber and was telling us how they'd open up the bomber doors and take pictures of the battlefields. And I wish I had the photos, but he remembers taking photos of Normandy Beach after all that happened. If you'll notice on the left, that's my Aunt Alice. She was in the waves. She just turned 86, and she and I are supposed to have a phone call about how all that transpired. My Aunt Gloria on the right was also involved in war work, and my mom, as I said, was a Rosie the Riveter. She soon as she found out that these jobs were available, she went to Weber Showcase in Los Angeles, which actually still exists today, and they told her that she was too young. She had to be 16. So the first thing she did on her 16th birthday, she got up, took the trolley, and got her job as a Rosie the Riveter, and she actually welded bomber doors, so the very iconic, typical bomber doors. She also tells me that there was some magazine from Weber Showcase that had a picture of her in her outfit welding, which I'm really trying to track down, so we should talk about that later. So after the war, my parents moved to Oregon, and you can see them here. This is 1946. You can see them here in front of my great-grandfather's garden. So during the war, it was a victory garden. After the war, it was just a garden. But I show you this photo because my dad learned how to garden from my great-grandfather, and then he in turn taught me. And he helped my grandfather every year until he died in the late 60s, and then we bought some property in the 1970s when I was very young, and the first thing Dad did was put in a garden, and that's where I learned how to garden. So how many of you are gardeners here? Great. How many of you are edible gardeners? Even better. How many of you are eaters? Everybody. All right. Well, good. Well, there's hope for you to become an edible gardener. So the second part that drove me to this story was I love gardening. I have a whole family history of it. And in addition to that, in addition to my dad teaching me everything that he knew from my great-grandfather, who was a victory gardener, when I went to college at the University of Oregon, I had the pleasure of learning how to, what I called at the time, hippie garden, from someone that was one of the original employees at Smith & Hawken. So she taught me how to compost and how to do raised beds and all that sort of stuff, which at the time, you know, was hippie gardening, and now it's just what everybody's doing. And I think it's funny that, you know, when I went to college, it didn't really challenge my political or religious beliefs, but it did challenge my gardening style. So I love gardening. I've had many gardens as an adult. My husband and I, we live in Chicago, and for 7 years we lived in a condo with no outdoor space, and every spring it became very bad because there's no community gardens. There was a backyard there, but it was too shady. And so every spring we had this, you know, like, oh, I want to garden. Oh, I can't garden. It was a problem. So one February, it was February 2006, he woke up one morning, he said, should we go look for a house? It was a Saturday. And then he said, wait a second, should we go look for a yard? I said, I think that's a really good idea. So we went looking for a yard with a house attached to it. And we found this 3,500 square foot, very sunny, no huge trees or condos or apartments looking into it yard. And in 2007, we installed our raised bed organic paradise that we like to call the Yarden. And so I was able to take everything my parents had taught me, everything I'd learned from my Smith and Hawken friend in college, and everything I'd learned from all the gardens that I'd done up to that point, and started doing this. And at the same time, I really realized, this was in 2007, I started blogging about it. People are really hungry to, pardon the pun, but hungry to learn how to grow their own food, hungry to understand the stories of seed diversity, etc. Hungry to learn how to can. You know, people were really wanting to know how to do all these things. And since I had the gift of these wonderful parents that not only taught me to garden, but taught me how to do all those other things, cooking, baking, etc., I found a lot of joy just blogging about it and sharing it, and that's been a lot of fun. So the third piece that brought me to this Victory Garden story, literally, and I say this with all sincerity, is community. I was standing at our local butcher, literally, Muller Meats, and I was waiting for my order of chicken, and I looked over at the wall, and there was this photo, and I was like, what is that? And they're great guys, Ruben and Irv. So we were chatting, and they said, well, you know, this is a picture of a Victory Garden. This is right by their building. If you'll notice in the lower bottom, there's a sort of a rail. It was taken in the building right next door to theirs. The woman that took it worked for a magazine and then lived in this neighborhood her entire life. So when she passed away, her family, going through her belongings, found this picture, and they knew that Ruben and Irv liked to collect these old photos, so they went and took it to them, and it was on their wall. So we started talking about, you know, Victory Gardens and how they fed the country, and I kind of got a little obsessed about it. I'd like you to notice the big V in the middle and the flagpole. So anyway, this picture really drove me to, all those things collided. My love of gardening, my love talking about gardening, my parents, and it drove me to want to explore this story. And I'd said those sound bites earlier, right? But really, when you get down to it, how do you teach an entire city to grow their own food? You know, that sound bite is a little tiny veneer along a big, deep, deep story. So that drove me to sort of explore this idea. That's how I met Jennifer, and we dove into all this funness. So I'm going to give you a little story about the U.S. participation in Victory Gardens that's slanted toward Chicago. And I am also, I think there's a little irony that I'm talking about World War II and old technology, and I'm using an iPad and an airbook. But anyway, that's a different story. So, you know, it's not my goal to dive deeply into World War II, but just talk about the bumpers. You know, the war started in December 1941, with shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and then ended August 15th, 1945. So that gave us 4 years where we had the big Victory Garden movement. For our purposes, we're going to talk mostly about 1942 and 1943 because that's the primary material I have from Chicago. So war on the home front. Let's just give you a little overview. During the latter part of 1941, when the country was actively preparing for national defense, there are already signs of food shortages and rising prices, especially in fresh vegetables. Great industries were transformed into munitions plants, and this quickly absorbed much of the country's pool of unemployment from the Depression. Now, an interesting fact is, during the Depression, there was a lot of food, but not a lot of money to buy it. During World War II, there was more money, but not a lot of food to buy. Part of that's because, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the first industries to feel the pinch of the labor shortage was that of the fresh vegetable growers, as the lower paid field workers found higher paying jobs in munitions and other war-related industries. Transportation lines were quickly conscripted to move troops and munitions, which also impacted the delivery of fresh produce from farms to urban areas. As one of the bigwigs at the Chicago Victory Garden movement phrased it, Uncle Sam needs trains for munitions, so we'll have to grow our own carrots. So everybody got in the action, from the smallest family groupings, and I hope that the mother is taking the picture and not pulling the plow in this picture. People used whatever means they could to prepare their victory gardens. Here you see the mayor of the Boston Commons plowing up the famous Boston Commons. Everyone was drafted in the victory garden effort. This was a circus in Chicago, a publicity photo obviously, but you get the point. Religious orders got involved, movie stars, and I like to point out that I normally wear my hair like this when I'm gardening, but didn't have time to do that for you today. Cartoon characters, superheroes. I love Robin schwitzing up there because he's working too hard. Industries, especially garden-related industries, jumped in full force. And victory gardening became very fashionable. This is a photo of a window display at Marshall Fields, and the sign says, "To make your victory garden grow, wear gay and chic gardening apparel." Located in the sport department, floor 6. International Harvester, a Chicago-based manufacturer of plows, now known as Navistar, was a big supporter of the victory garden movement. And hand in hand with food growing came food preservation. The growing and harvesting season in Chicago are just a few months of the year, obviously, and the food shortage went year-round. And so canning became what everybody was up to. Modern freezing techniques were not widely used, and tin and other materials used for store-bought canned goods were being used for munitions. And women were encouraged to can, dehydrate, brine, and otherwise preserve the harvest. One statistic that I found when I was researching was that 5 billion pints, a pint's about this size, 5 billion pints per summer, let that sink in a little bit, were canned by housewives, communities, to, store food for the winter. So you can see from this industrious poster that it was a real war job. An interesting fact is, this is one of those sound bites that should be spread around that's not, is that during the height of World War II, we were on 50-plus battlefields across the world, and the U.S. quartermaster was responsible for 24 million meals a day. That's a lot of food over there. So, of course, we need to do a lot over here. So I'm going to read you a little excerpt from the Times. This is actually a photo from Seattle. Americans started gardening. Gardens began sprouting behind signposts at the bases of railroad embankments, in schoolyards and churchyards, and in window boxes. They were attended by housewives who left babies in sandboxes while they knelt to scoop and sift the soil, and by little girls who wheeled their trowels and rakes into their plots in doll buggies, and by war workers back to the good earth for the first time since they waded barefoot in mud puddles as children. So the historic gardening campaign of World War II began. So the Office of Civilian Defense. I mentioned a little earlier that I got a little obsessed with this story. We associate that with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. I'd like to point out that the initials of this organization are also OCD, and there's a reason for that. But I'll get to that shortly. Fiorello LaGuardia, the flamboyant mayor of New York City, was put in charge of the Office of Civilian Defense effort nationally. While the attention of the Civilian Defense Organization was at the outset centered around the preventative measures against air attack, sabotage, and the like, it was recognized that the same organization might well function in the Victory Garden field, and the OCD administrator in Washington, D.C. issued a memorandum in 1942 urging local coordinators to set up the machinery for promoting victory gardens. Some of the duties of the Office of Civilian Defense were air raid surveillance, attack training, scrap and fat collection, war bond sales, morale committees, and of course victory gardens. Rumor has it that the Office of Civilian Defense was the brainchild of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was concerned about the morale of the nation in the shadow of a potentially long war and encouraged her husband to put the wheels in motion for the creation of the Office of Civilian Defense. Fiorello LaGuardia was not pleased with his election to the leadership of this campaign and put his duties on the back burner. And so Eleanor Roosevelt, in an effort not to be seen as taking charge, was appointed to be his secretary, and in many ways directed this national activity from the shadows. So Chicago. This is a note from the Times. Victory gardening in World War II was radically different in character and extent from the corresponding activity in World War I. Lack of sustained promotion, absence of any organizational scheme of promoting gardening, and generally haphazard and wasteful methods destroyed much of the usefulness and productivity of the so-called war garden movement of World War I. In World War II, at least in Chicago, most of these faults were recognized before actual fighting took place. A thorough and complete scheme of organization was set up, largely due to the aid of the Chicago Park District and the local Office of Civilian Defense. There was a continuous program of promotion, stimulation, guidance, and active help. So this is Mayor Kelly, who was in charge of the Office of Civilian Defense for Illinois. He promptly appointed bigwigs at the Chicago Park District to help with this effort. Now, we were lucky, Chicago was lucky, because less than a decade before 1942, the 3 park districts that made up the Chicago area had been melded into one park district. So they had gone through the process of streamlining and having departments and all that. And also due to the Depression, Chicago was able to afford Ivy League landscape architects, horticulturalists, etc. So the park district was in fine form during the Depression and when this effort started. They had the leadership and the organization to help kick this into high gear. So the Victory Garden goals, and you know that this was written by someone in the Park District because of the last bullet point, was stimulate as many people as possible to apply themselves during their leisure hours to the production of food plants. They weren't asking people to quit their jobs. They weren't asking them to work longer hours. They were saying, when you have some spare time, do this. Provide novice gardeners and those not familiar with vegetable growing with information to make their efforts most productive. And here's the Park District voice. Lay a foundation for continued expansion of the program in peacetime. And the resources to accomplish this were a lot of vacant lots, backyards, the strong park and school districts, libraries, corporate support, and a devoted citizenry, of which 90% had never gardened before. They weren't landscape gardeners that had never grown food. They had never gardened before at all. So to accomplish this, and the other mandates of the OCD, the city was divided into 7 divisions. The Loop, which is sort of that missing area there, Division 7, they decided that was not suitable for victory gardening by individuals, although there were some parks there that had demonstration gardens. But all 77 Chicago neighborhoods were segregated into one of the 7 divisions, and each had a division chairman that reported to the Office of Civilian Defense. Each neighborhood had a community chairman that reported to the division chairman, and each block had a block captain that reported to the community chairman. You're getting the OCD part here. And there are also other committees: Advisory Committee, Committee of Demonstration Gardens, General Committee, Committee on Food Preservation, Committee on Planning, and the Committee on Kinds of Vegetables. So people were very organized, and they really wanted to participate, and there was a place for everybody. So the block captain duties were to secure land 3 to 4 blocks from homes, prepare the site, arrange for plowing, participate in the Victory Garden Council, maintain enthusiasm, and plan harvest festivals. If any of you have worked on community gardens today, you know that this really, other than the participate in Victory Garden Council, hasn't really changed. You know, you want your garden within walking distance of where people live. You need someone to oversee the site itself, the development of it, and you need to have some fun. So I'm going to veer off a little bit and talk about harvest festivals. I mentioned International Harvester earlier. If you look on the lower left, this was sponsored by them. I imagine one of their plows was pulling this. This is a parade float. Interesting, you're not from Chicago, but for people that are from Chicago, this is if in the upper right you'll notice it says Streeterville. That's a neighborhood in the Loop that's very, very congested now. It's just south of the Loop, off the Mag Mile, which I'm sure you all know, the Magnificent Mile. Here is the Soldier Field Harvest Festival, which is held in 1943. It was held in the exhibit hall underneath the seats in the south end of the old Soldier Field. Sponsored by the Chicago Sun, practically every community in the Chicago metropolitan area participated. Hundreds of exhibits of garden produce, flowers, and canned goods were featured. The Park District and commercial growers also participated. Thousands of visitors participated and pledged to grow victory gardens in 1944. What you probably can't see is the signage here says victory over floods, victory over drought, and victory over pests. That's what that far one says. And this is, excuse me. So early efforts were taken to prevent the pillaging of victory gardens. Effective July 24, 1942, the city enacted an ordinance with fines of $50 to $200 that prohibited entry, pilfering, or injury of plants in any garden which displayed the official emblem of the Victory Garden Department. In today's currency, those fines would be between $650 and $2,600. So they weren't fooling about these gardens. So how did they know? How did one know that it was a victory garden, not just someone's garden? Well, this is really the genius that helps us understand those sound bites a little bit better. What is believed to be the first system of reporting and recording victory garden efforts for statistical purposes in any part of the United States was established in Chicago for the season of 1942. A simple system of distributing decals in exchange for information used for statistical purposes was first established for the 1942 growing season. A great deal of labor and energy on the part of block captains was required to secure these reports, but the effort was worth it as it provided a framework for the metrics that recorded the success of the Chicago Victory Garden program and ultimately the national program as well. So, Decalomania. I don't think six-color printing was as big of a deal. It was a big deal. It's not a big deal to us now, but it was then. So the word Decalomania was everywhere. If they would have been making T-shirts back then, it would have said Decalomania. They were nuts about it. So 75,000 were distributed in 1942, and 100,000 were distributed in 1943. And it was pretty simple. You had your name, your address, and the location and size of your garden. That information was then sent to your block captain, was sent up to this, all that whole chain of command. And that's how we started recording that in 1942. That effort was so successful that the USDA sent out to all the other major metropolitan areas in the country to do likewise for the continuing growing seasons. So the person that was in charge of press for the Victory Garden movement was also the person that came up with the decal. So you'll notice that you'll see the decal in a lot of places. This is a demonstration garden in Lincoln Park. This was the South Lawndale community that I was telling you about. And also, aside from the poster you saw earlier where the woman was shooting the Nazi bug on her tomato, this is the only other instance I've seen of people using, this may not be a chemical, but using something that could potentially be a chemical. This gentleman pointing is the man that's responsible for the information we have today. He was in charge of PR for this program. He came up with Decalomania, and this is him pointing at a picture of one of the decals. And as I said earlier, this successful method of analysis and organization was quickly noticed by the National Victory Garden Institute and the USDA and was sent out to other metropolitan areas as a means for organizing and morale boosting among victory gardeners. And again, I just like to point out 90% of these victory gardeners in Chicago had never gardened before, and they also were very well dressed. So of course, that in mind, education was a huge piece of this effort. An extensive program of lectures were presented in 6 different locations throughout the city by horticultural staff from the Park District, leaders in the seed trade, and commercial growers. They served as formal lecturers. In addition, individual lectures were provided by garden clubs and similar organizations. So in 1943, 162 sanctioned garden lectures, countless garden club lectures, and mass meetings showing movies or slideshows. So if you go to YouTube and put in Victory Garden movie, you'll get one of these movies. They're very interesting to watch, and I like to look at it and think of all these people that want to not only learn how to grow their own food, but want to be part of this effort, sitting in a gym somewhere during one of these sanctioned lectures and getting their garden propaganda. Anyway, most of the education dealt simply and briefly with the fundamentals of vegetable gardening, of value to the beginner, and stressed the particular conditions of the Chicago area. We were talking earlier about some of the periodicals that are outside. You know, if you've gardened anywhere else, you realize that each area is different. So the material for Chicago is probably not applicable for California, right? So they're very place specific. Here's another one. A lot of the newspapers distributed these periodicals. This gardening was not leisure gardening. It wasn't, oh, you may want to do this, you may want to do this. This was about nutrition. It was about abundance, and it was about organization. So this is one of several plans that I found that show Here's the things that you want to grow. Many of them had accompanying seed lists that would talk about the seeds that were applicable to your growing area. I did a blog post called The Lost Victory Garden List of 1943 that lists the things that were suggested for Chicago. Here's another victory garden for a family of 5. And you'll notice, we got the pole beans on the left, so it's not shading anything. I also learned about New Zealand spinach because of this. I had never heard of it or grown it. New Zealand spinach isn't really a spinach. It's a spinach-like plant that doesn't, that can grow in the summer, which is, Chicago summers are very hot, so that was one of the recommendations. I grew it last year. It's really good if you want to give it a try. It's available out there now. Newspapers were also in the act. In early April, when gardening activities were at their height, special garden columns were arranged in Chicago newspapers. Weekly features by garden personalities provided the basics for the army of novice Chicago gardeners. 15-minute radio programs were aired daily Monday through Friday. This medium gave the Victory Garden Department a forum to broadcast statements or interviews without restriction. Interviews with garden authorities, amateur gardeners who had accomplished interesting or outstanding results, and community leaders who could tell of the enthusiasm and the generous crops of their constituents were also interviewed. This particular show is called Know Your Onions. Every day, know your onions. I also just like to take a little break and tell you some of the human interest stories. It's a long time ago, lots of statistics, but competition is part of the gardening thing, right? So I'm going to read you a few things here. Rejoice, kids. Spinach seeds to be scarce. Mother and sons go 13 miles to make a garden. Big profit on 64 cents. Last year, 2 years ago, a book came out called The $25 Victory Garden. Back then it was a 64-cent victory garden. War gardeners use lights to lengthen days. The photo, unfortunately, I can't show you for this, was a very yuppie-looking couple that had rigged lights on their porch that they could shine them so when they got home from work at night, they could do their gardening. Bedridden, she also aids in gardening. This was a very interesting story about a lady in the suburbs, bedridden, who acted as the clearinghouse. So Garden A had too many beets and Garden C had too much corn. She was sort of the air traffic controller that made sure everybody could trade their surplus and make that happen. Joe Green, busy in his garden, forgets taxes. and here's the competitive part. The 4-foot radish, the 41-inch bean, and the 12-pound cabbage. The 12-pound cabbage I can believe. The 41-inch bean, I'm not so sure. And finally, man who traded Victory Garden truck for beer. Wife divorces him. This is a little bit of a trick question, but there was also social media back then. It wasn't Twitter. It wasn't Facebook. It was these kiosks. They were on every corner, and all the notices were put there. People walked to their neighbor's house, walked to the grocer. That's how they got their information for a lot of this stuff. So that was the precursor to our social media. Now I have to tell you this. When I gave this lecture for the first time at the Chicago Flower and Garden Show, this family walked in right when this slide came up, and they turned around and walked out. It may not seem like a very interesting topic, but it is sort of the keystone of how all this happened in Chicago. My husband is also rolling his eyes because he doesn't like this section. But there's a lot of pictures of what I like to call plow porn. Lots of gripping and grabbing between, the plow operators and the Office of Civilian Defense and the Park District people. As I mentioned earlier, International Harvester was a Chicago-based company that was very involved in that. Early in 1942, International Harvester was approached, and they very patriotically and promptly turned over 3 new plows for plowing vacant property in city limits. The Park District provided operators fuel and supplies for these 3 plows. Demand for plowing was so intense, rules were set up to regulate it. So, plot must be this big, had to have written permission from the landowner. Someone had to inspect it to make sure that it was actually a good growing place, surface was level, sunny, fertile, and 4 families were required to participate. Here's an interesting picture. I'm going to read what this says. This shows the tractor plow provided by the Victory Garden Department, Office of Civilian Defense, through the cooperation of the Chicago Park District and the International Harvester Company. This Victory Garden is being prepared at the vacant lot at 5400 Ferdinand Street. The man with the rake is Frank L. Bennett, head of the Concert Bureau, who resides in the building shown in the background and who was the moving spirit in developing this Victory Garden. This shows the same area included in Photo A, except now that Mr. Bennett and his neighbors have something to show for their labors. The garden is located in North Austin Community, where Mr. Bennett is Victory Garden Committee Chairman. He got promoted from Concert Bureau. It also says, notice the shrinkage in his waistline as a result of his gardening activities. This photo is taken at the inception of the Community Victory Garden at 50th and Ingleside, a congested apartment house district in Chicago. The tractor plow, provided by the International Harvester Company for the Victory Garden Committee, is preparing the soil at an unsightly vacant lot that later will be transformed into a neat and productive garden. You'll also notice some people over here examining the soil. I don't know if you can see that in the photo. This photo doesn't have anything on the back of it, but I do know that it's Bell and Howard, which is sort of the borderline between Chicago and Evanston, which is the next, the first suburb to the north. So this is the before photo. It's the after photo. I love that, so I'm going to show you again. It's the before. We've got our industrious International Harvester plow working it. And the after. Here's another one for you. Sprung originally from the green prairie acres of the Midwest, Chicago goes back to the soil as her citizens begin a tremendous Victory Garden campaign. One of more than 300 projected community gardens for the North Side, Division 6, is this portion of the emerald turf back campus of the Presbyterian Theological Seminary at Belden and Bissell. Last year I was speaking at DePaul University and I showed this photo, gave my lecture, and afterwards the instructor came up to me and he said, "That's right around the corner." I'm like, "Oh yeah." He's like, "No, literally it's right around the corner." So I packed up my stuff and we walked around the corner. There's the photo of what it is today. Same place. Now you can't see over here, but there's a big soccer field. So there's a little strip of grass, and then there's a spot that's about 15 feet wide and about 25 feet long, and I've been pestering them that maybe we need to put another Victory Garden in there because it would be good for the kids to learn about that. There's the soccer field. So in 1942, 108 separate community plots, some as large as 6 to 8 acres, were put into production. I'm going to read some more from the time. Statistics are usually dull, but when more than 12,000 city residents become farmers virtually overnight, and all for the same purpose, that makes for some facts that are interesting reading. The 4 Southside divisions included 66,000 farm families cultivating almost 8 million square feet. The 2 Northside divisions included almost 6,000 farm families growing on almost 5 million square feet. In the suburbs, 14,000 families were issued the emblem and cultivated 28 million square feet. The 1943 growing season was unusually wet, so plowing of inspected vacant lots could not start until March 30th. As May advanced, demand for plowing was so great that the Park District secured 2 additional plows, and for a number of weeks there were 5 plows operating. 2 shifts operated from sunrise to sunset, including Saturdays and Sundays. And I'd just like to point out 1,500 separate community plots, and Division 5 was the largest Victory Garden in the nation, and it was worked by 800 families. So children, we got children in the action back then too. Recognizing the rising enthusiasm for Victory Gardens by adults might demand much of the lawn space in the Chicago parks, the Victory Garden Department suggested in the later part of 1942 that school children's plots be set aside on park property during the 1943 season. All parks were surveyed to determine suitable spaces that had good soil and sunlight and were available and not interrupting other recreational things. Working with public schools and youth leaders, 5th through 8th graders were provided plots in the park property. Now, I mentioned 1943 was a wet spring, so the poor weather conditions in 1943 interfered with this plan, and by the time the growing season could start, many of the children had lost interest. So instead of 30,000 plots, only 14,000 plots were gardened. Only 14,000 plots. And we still have the Chicago Park District. See what I'm saying? Anyway, I had mentioned earlier that parades and other showings of enthusiasm were recommended. Here's one instance. Has anybody ever seen a Frankenstein movie where the villagers have the torches and the pitchforks and they're going after the monster? I kind of think of that when I see this picture. But this is the description. Thousands of children in the upper grammar grades are being assigned garden plots, 5 by 12 in size, in 65 Chicago parks this week and next week. The typical planting plan for these plots includes a row of petunias at one end and zinnias at the other, with rows of lettuce, radish, snap beans, kohlrabi, carrots, and beets in between. Complete seed packets containing just the right amount of seed for each of these rows has been prepared and provided for the children with the compliments of Marshall Field and Company. Here are some of the children marching to their plots in parade form from Garfield Park. Special literature and publications were created and distributed, specially targeted toward children. 4-H was a program that was mostly for rural areas, but I really like this photo, so I had to show you. This is a local 4-H group showing their vegetables they're planning to grow. This is actually a program that Sears did, where they found girls from across the country that had been leaders in the 4-H movement, brought them together for a luncheon. You can't see it on this map, but it shows the names of all the girls that were selected as the leaders. Boy Scouts got into the effort. This photo said something along the lines of, the boys liked to march in formation to their garden because they felt it prepared them for their military service. Here's more girls gardening for victory. And here's a school program. One of the many successful Victory Garden projects conducted through Chicago's public schools was that in charge of Miss Flersham, principal of the Brennan School. A nearby vacant lot was turned into a very fine vegetable and flower growing plot. A special ceremony and party was held on the day the garden was started and plots assigned. Right through the summer, including the hot vacation period, these youngsters continued their cultivation and insect control. Because of Miss Flersham's excellent leadership, a fine crop of vegetables resulted. Now, this is the photo that was shown in the newspaper, but I found another photo. And I'd just like you to think for a moment, trying to corral all these children into gardening. This guy in the front, I would say he had a sugar high, but sugar was rationed, so maybe it was a molasses high, but I know he got busted for something. Of course, the children were as rigorously involved in this program as everyone else, so they had their statistics that were filled out by their teachers and then rolled up to the Office of Civilian Defense. So we've covered education, parks, plowing. I want to talk about the harvest for this overall effort. 1942, 12,000 plus family gardens on 509 community plots, 290 acres. This is just community gardens. This isn't people's backyards or people that didn't want to be joiners that might have figured out their own community situation. 1943, 53,000 family gardens on 1,500 community plots, 14,000 children's gardens on 908 acres. So how Chicago did it. Just to summarize: government support, overarching organizational structure, donations of space and equipment, mass education via classes, newspapers, radio, promotion, corporate and individual commitment, and recognition. I also like to point out, before I go on to the next section of this, is that Victory Gardens didn't stop abruptly when the war ended. After the war ended, we were all over the world helping people, helping bombed out countries, helping people that were starving, and so gardens became freedom gardens. So food fights the red menace was one of the types of messages that we were giving. So that happened for 2 or 3 years. And then they became, as the GIs were coming home and the GI Bill was happening, inflation started happening, and so they became thrift gardens. So by the mid-1950s, people continued gardening, these 20 million people. The effort in, the USDA and communities was to keep people gardening. Around the mid-50s, it turned into the America Beautiful type of campaign, and people started doing more landscape gardening than edible gardening. And then we lose track of any of the efforts that were put forward on a national level to make this happen. But it's happening again, right? And so we're gonna keep track of it. There's a new Victory Garden movement happening, and people are motivated by different things. We don't have one single thing that we're fighting toward together, but everybody has their own motivation. The economy, cost of fuel, food safety, environmental concerns, GMO, loss of seed diversity, self-sufficiency, and we all know as edible gardeners that homegrown food tastes better. This is a bad picture, but we're in the backyard of an incredible effort by Michelle Obama to get the country growing their own food and fighting obesity. We also have Tom Vilsack, who has started the People's Garden Project, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which has been feeding people across the country, those gardens. The USDA says put them on your property if you have them, or help a community garden, and they've given tens of thousands of pounds of food last season to food shelters and the hungry. It's really a great program. So I want to talk about communities today. We don't have, people lament the loss of social structure. We don't have fraternal organizations, or people don't have time to go to church, what have you. But communities exist nonetheless, especially around gardening. There's a couple things that I'd like to point out that I've noticed in the last few years about how social media has created new communities around gardening. The first thing is the number one way people learn about community or gardening is from their neighbors. And the number two thing used to be books, and now recently it's been the web, social media, etc. I like to point out this book because it's a book, but it also has a social media twist. The authors of this book reached out to the world via Facebook and Twitter and said, you know, we want to write this book for people that are new to gardening and we want your input. And so they used, you know, social channels to collect information and develop this book. The cool thing about it is they're still active. So if you're reading this book as a new gardener and you have a question on page 94 about Brussels sprouts, you can reach out to these people and they'll answer your questions. So I think that this sort of thing is probably going to happen a lot in the future, but this is the first instance of it that I've noticed, and I think that's a really cool blending of traditional methods and new stuff. In Chicago, you know, we have a lot of community gardens in Chicago. We have over 700 community gardens. And every spring, we have a project called, where we grow together, the One Seed Chicago program. This year was the first year where it was all edible. So how the One Seed Chicago program works is we vote on 3 different types of seeds. So last year it was bee balm, echinacea, and something else. I don't remember what it was. This year, though, it was eggplant, chard, and radish. And so we had a lot of arguing going back and forth. We had team chard and team eggplant, and actually chard won. That was my vote. But this is a really fun thing because everybody gets to vote and learn about these things. Chefs were providing recipes. Everybody gets involved. And then when the vote is actually announced, everybody gets a free packet of seeds, which is fun. Anyway, go chard. I'm not biased. You know, the Victory Garden movement, I know that there's the Fenway Parks and Fenway Gardens in Boston is a constantly active Victory Garden. We have one in Chicago. This is called Rainbow Beach, and this has existed since World War II. But other than that, we don't have any existing Victory Gardens in Chicago. Until, I'm going to come back to this photo. I live not far from here, and my mother says I have more spunk than sense, which is really true. I'm sure my husband can corroborate that for you. Anyway, this is Peterson Avenue, where you see that train, and we live over here. So one day we were driving down this street, and there's an empty lot. There's an empty lot on the corner just past that street. And we're driving along, and all of a sudden it all clicked to me, and I'm like, that's the lot from the picture. Peter's like, what? We're almost getting in a car accident. I'm like, that's the lot from the picture. And so I thought it would be really interesting to see if we could do World War II Victory Garden style, put in a garden very quickly. And so the game plan was to get some government support, get some donation of space and equipment, having an organizational structure, mass education, corporate individual commitment, and recognition. I just took the Victory Garden playbook and tweaked it a little bit for modern times. And so here we have 1943, what that lot looked like, and then what it looked like, not today, but last year. Big, empty, trash-strewn lot. And so I like to say this is actually history re-eating itself, but we formed the Peterson Garden Project, and this was our plan for what the garden would look like. It actually ended up looking very similar to that. I was the block captain, right? So I took on my responsibility to be the block captain, and part of that was morale boosting. This was at our groundbreaking, and I made everybody do a sing-along. That's our alderman laughing at me. But he's been actually doing his part as government support. We use Facebook and Twitter to reach out to people, and it was amazing how quickly word spread. We also put up a banner on the site, and we distributed flyers to the houses immediately around the garden. And we did that on May 27th. April 27th, we announced the garden. May 2nd, we had a community meeting where over 50 people showed up, showing their interest. This was our groundbreaking on May 20th last year, so not even a year ago. And then hopefully this video will show. There is sound to this. I'll talk over this a little bit. So between May 20th and June 7th, completely volunteer, funded by volunteers, we spread 250 cubic yards. So if you know, that's like a mountain twice the size of this room of mulch. We built 157 raised beds. We, this is them putting it together. When we were building the beds, we're like, can we put them out? Can we put them out? I'm like, no, wait, we want to put the camera up there so we could see it all coming together. So we put 157 raised beds. They're all 6x4. We put weed barrier down. We spread, each individual gardener spread put their own soil in. We had 110 cubic yards of an organic soil mushroom compost mix. I'm going to get to this in a little bit. Just like World War II, many of these people had never grown their own food before. We wanted them to, be part of it. So you'll see shortly as they start putting their soil in that we're using the raised bed method. Let's see. You'll start seeing how someone's going to mark it off right here. You can see it. So we had classes. You can see me there a little bit. We had classes on the weekends. We had a plant sale. We were there to just teach people. Many people had never touched a seed before. Like, we have a huge diversity of people in this garden, but, just kind of terrified. They just didn't know what to do. And so many of those people, this is the most satisfying bit of all of that. Many of those people are coming back this year and they're taking their new gardeners under their wing and showing them the ropes. It's really exciting. I had one woman tell me, I was visiting the garden the other day, and she was, they put their, oh, no, I guess not. She was telling me that there's the square foot stuff down there. She was telling me that she was helping her neighbor, and she's like, I was terrified last year. I'm like, you were? She's like, yeah, I was absolutely terrified. But, I'm just telling my neighbor that stuff likes to grow, I'm like, that's great. That's a really good thing to tell people. She's like, you told me that last year. I'm like, oh, okay, well, it's right. Stuff wants to grow. So that's how it ended up looking at the end of the season. Ended up accidentally, in my more spunk than sense thinking, I'm like, well, if 20 people want to do this, it'll be fine. It'll be fun. And it ended up being the largest edible organic garden in the city. So anyway, back to education. We taught people using the square foot gardening method because the beds, we wanted them to be manageable. We didn't want huge beds that people would be overwhelmed by. So we taught them using the square foot gardening method. If you're familiar with Gardener Supply, if you're gardeners, you probably are, they have an awesome kitchen garden tool, a planning tool, a drag and drop thing where you can put the size of your bed and then drag and drop all the stuff that you want to grow, and then it'll print out a guide for you. So we asked all of our gardeners to do that, decide what you want to grow, print out your guide, and that's your homework, and then they would come and we'd adjust. Like, well, maybe you don't want all the tomatoes in a row, it might shade this, or you really don't need 12 pepper plants in a 6x4 bed. The different advice that we would give people. It was very successful. We also, community building and morale was important. So we took opportunities to let people educate each other in a fun environment. So this was our seed swap that we did earlier in January. This was before the One Seed Chicago vote was announced. So I have a little subliminal advertising for Chard there. We did a dedication. We keep it very patriotic, and we're doing it again like we did in World War II. Again, we just try and make it fun for the community to participate. So we really didn't want people running in and picking their lettuce and running out. We wanted them participating in this community. So we have these events. We have a stage in the garden where we'll have musicians. We have lots of fun reasons for them to feel community oriented. We've got a lot of support. I mentioned during World War II that was important. These are some of the people that have been interested in helping us with our garden. As Jennifer said earlier, even before this garden started, a production company contacted us about telling this story, the historical piece, and using our garden as a pivot. Not that our garden's the point, but as a pivot for how communities are coming together to do this in Chicago, and hopefully inspire other people in the country as well. We're hoping that will be done in January of 2012. So here's a little recap. These are my parents. I like to call, they've been married 67 years. My dad just turned 84. And I just like to illustrate that in their lifetime, something that's happened that I like to call the big duh. Everything that they knew and did and still do is what we want to do now. And there's not enough people that know how to garden. And there's not enough people that know how to can. And sadly, there's not enough people that know how to cook. Right? So I feel that we're in a place now where if any of you know how to do any of those things, it's very important to be able to pass that on to someone. We did that because I'm obsessive compulsive, as you can tell, and because we love it. And so we have a great history here in this country, and I think we get distracted by the media and we get hearing all this negative stuff. But there are gardens like this happening all over the country, and communities coming together and embracing how we've done this before and how we want to do this in the future. And so I want to leave you with one last soundbite. You know, there we go. One last soundbite. JFK said, "One person can make a difference and everyone should try." So I wasn't expecting this to turn into what it has turned into, because I was just one person. I wanted to try and make a difference, and I know all of you as gardeners or friends or neighbors can also make a difference. So I would encourage you this summer to help someone learn how to grow, help someone learn how to can, help someone learn how to cook. And so that's what I have to say today. I'm very appreciative of your time, and if you have any questions that you'd like me to answer, I'd be happy to. Am I running out of time? Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Do we have questions for LaManda?
Yes.
I'll start.
Oh, go ahead. You do it. No, you do it.
We'll start with you, sir.
In your research on the Victory Garden in Chicago, were you able to determine what level of city support was provided in terms of the inputs to the projects, such as seeds, water, tools, fertilizer, and those?
None. It was all, they did the plowing. Many organizations like Marshall Fields or different seed companies donated seeds, but the city itself did not fund any materials. They went with the park district to do the education, but it was mostly done by individuals and corporations.
So how did you do the water?
I have no idea how they did the water. Are you talking about the water in our garden?
Yeah.
In Chicago, we have a system of aldermen that are in charge of the different neighborhoods, and our aldermen, they have a thing called menu money, which it's sort of a pool that they're allowed to take out of to do various things. So our alderman used some of his menu money to put in our water supply. And water is the hugest thing with any community garden. You know, many people would like to have them, but unless you can get an alderman to pay for it, or you do a fundraiser or what have you, you can't. And we've learned that if you put the garden in, we're putting in another garden this summer in another lot not far from us in a very congested neighborhood. But we've learned that if you start doing the work, people get really interested. But if you start from a theoretical perspective, you know, we're going to do this next spring, whatever, it's harder to do. So my point is, it's hard to get people to donate money if they're not actually doing the activity. So unless you get the alderman to commit to that, it's kind of hard to get those going.
I wanted to ask about, I had done some reading on Victory Gardens and how the USDA had actually discouraged it. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, and that they thought that home gardeners are squandering all the resources and they should be funneled to professional growers, aka farmers.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The comment was, Kathy had said that during her research she found that the USDA was not positive about the home Victory Garden movement, to the point that they discouraged Eleanor Roosevelt from having a Victory Garden at the White House. But after the first season, when they realized how effective it was, what a morale-boosting activity it was, then they jumped on board. It's a funny story, isn't it? They really just did not want people, and it was, they thought people would be wasting seeds and not be that productive, and so they wanted to funnel those resources to farms.
Joan.
Yeah, where did you get your photographs and your other material?
Oh, that's a librarian question. Yes, I got some from the National Agriculture Library, some from the archives,
here.
some
Yeah.
here, and some from resources in Chicago, and some online.
Great. Did the garden club movement, did that start around this time, or did that precede World War II? Do you know?
You know, I can't really answer that. Kathy, can you answer that?
It was definitely preceding it. The Plant Societies or Victorian era thing, you know, from the men's hobby, that. But World War I, there's a huge amount of garden clubs coming out of that. And then some petered off and resurged World War II and after.
The National Gardening Association started in the 1920s, and then that was one of the biggest associations in the country related to gardening, and then that became very active in the Victory Garden movement. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm involved with 4 community gardens here on Capitol Hill, and they're all in the
forget it, yeah.
All of these gardens get their water from a neighbor, garden neighbor, who has to, backs up to the garden. And we run a hose from the back of the house spigot out to their gate, and then we use a system of quick connects and hoses. So we hitch up the hoses when we want water, and then we pay them for their.
Oh, that's a good solution.
So that's another solution.
We have a woman that lives across the alley from the garden, and she's we call her the garden mom because she's always there, and they won't turn our water on till after the frost date because they don't want any pipes breaking. So she's been her hose reel's right there, so she just, when she knows people are there, just runs it across the street. For a garden of that size, it probably would be too much for just that small water supply, but yeah, it's a great way to figure it out. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you
And
for your
I
time.
encourage you to see the books outside if you have it that we got.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.